Manchester United is bad. That statement may seem obvious, but it would have been unfathomable just 12 years ago when United won its record-setting 20th English League Championship, the 13th under legendary manager Sir Alex Ferguson. But after finishing 8th in the 23-24 campaign, the club's lowest finish of the Premier League era, United placed 15th this past season, and failed to win a trophy after losing to Tottenham in the Europa League final. That loss had massive consequences as a result in the club missing out on qualifying for the Champions League. This will make it harder to recruit top players, but more importantly, the financial consequences of missing European football are dire. It looks likely that United won't contend for the Premier League title for several more years, and for the first time, it appears possible that United will not recover for the foreseeable future. It is a low point for a club that has struggled so much in the post-Ferguson era. United have gone from the dominant team in English football, always in a title race, to a squad that hasn't even come close to the Premier League's crown in the decade plus since Fergie departed. The biggest reason for United's decline is its ownership, the Glazer family. To make a long story short, they took over the club in 2005 because of a horse, I'm not joking, and the way they did it saddled the club with debt that it is still paying off. This was scummy and its repercussions are still felt in Manchester today. If United does end up losing its status as a super club, the Glazers will be at fault. That being said, their impact on the pitch is more complicated. I'd argue that United's best ever period was from 2006 to 2009, under the Glazers. A big reason for that success was the players purchased under the Glazers, and even today, United still spends at the level of clubs that are owned by nation-states. If someone didn't know when the new owners came in, I don't think they'd be able to point to the correct date. They'd probably point to when Ferguson departed. This isn't to undersell the damage they caused the club. I will repeat, under their ownership, United went from a well-run club to one facing the prospect of financial calamity, and one could make the case that every mistake is the fault of those at the top. I just want to examine the full story of what went wrong on the pitch. Because something went very wrong. United went from the best club in England to finishing 15th and giving Spurs a trophy. And it feels like the change happened overnight. In May of 2013, United was celebrating a Premier League title. Then by October of the same year, everyone realized something had changed. So I'm going to run through everything that happened since Ferguson departed to try to find out how United fell from grace. The first manager to accept the poison chalice was Everton boss David Moyes, reportedly Ferguson's hand-picked successor. The move didn't work out, but it seemed like a sensible choice at the time. While I can recognize the hire didn't work out and I could use hindsight to point to why it was destined to fail, I don't think it was a bad move at the time, so I can't fault United for it. Moyes had Everton consistently punching above their financial weight. At the time, myself and several people following the Premier League considered Everton the clear 7th best club in England, just behind the Big Six, and Moyes was a huge reason for their success. Wanting to replicate his Goodison form, Moyes brought his entire backroom staff with him to Old Trafford and ditched Ferguson's staff. That decision was questionable, even at the time. I'll get into it more later. Now we need to look at the squad Ferguson left Moyes to work with. Again, I will repeat, this is not a hindsight rebuild. It's easy to look at the squad when most of their careers are over and point to what United should have done. There are decisions that went horribly wrong that seemed right at the time, but I won't fault United for not knowing things we know 10 plus years in the future. For example, it would have been right to sell Phil Jones the summer of 2013, but United couldn't have known that he would go through injury hell. At the time, it would have been stupid to sell Jones, even if it would have been the better move in the long run. Here's how things appeared after the 12-13 season. This is done with the help of Gene of the Bubsy Babe with his player reviews after United's Premier League winning campaign. Going from back to front, David De Gea was looked at as the goalkeeper of the future after finally getting over his consistency issues. Not much to say, United had an amazing number one. Moving to the defense, center back was seen as fine. Ferdinand and Vidic were 34 and 31 respectively, but both were coming off of good years, and Vidic was doing this after a knee injury, so his positive flashes were a promising sign. And while those two obviously couldn't be relied upon in the long term, United had 3 good young center backs to the club. The aforementioned Phil Jones was just 21 and highly regarded, with the likes of Fabio Capello and Ferguson singing his praises. At the time, the view was that he could be Rio Ferdinand's successor as an amazing on-ball center back. Chris Smalling and Johnny Evans were also fine defenders. Fullback, however, appeared to be an issue. On the left, Ever was only getting older. Wisdom at the time was that his successor needed to come quickly. His backup Butner wasn't looked at as anything but depth. On the right, Raphael was a talented young center back coming off a strong season, but there wasn't much depth behind him, though his twin brother Fabio wasn't a liability, and Jones was capable of playing right back. For that reason, not having much depth behind Raphael may have been intentional to get Jones game time while Ferdinand and Vidic were still going strong. You will see that the assessment of every position in the defense was wrong. United's midfield was a huge problem. We know this in hindsight, but everyone at the time knew it too. Michael Carrick was coming off a remarkable campaign, but there was no good partner for him. Shinji Kagawa was talented, but he was more of a backup to Rooney as a 10 or possibly a winger. Tom Cleverley wasn't seen as good, even at the time. Ferguson could get him to a job, but he wasn't a long-term option. Anderson was only 25, but he was already a shadow of his former self. For the old guard, Darren Fletcher couldn't be relied upon after his illness, Ryan Giggs was nearly 40, and Paul Scholes retired. The 32-year-old Michael Carrick was the only good midfielder. This position needed to be addressed. Likewise, winger was a weak position. Young and Valencia disappointed the previous season. In addition, Nani was no longer the player he used to be, or at least was going through a rut. Welbeck and Kagawa could cover out wide, but neither of the naturals there. But that summer, a promising young winger named Wilfried Zaha returned to Manchester United from loan after leading Crystal Palace to the Premier League. And it should be mentioned that Adnan Januzaj just won United's Reserve Player of the Year award. He was heavily involved in preseason and viewed as someone with breakout potential. Because of the young talent and the ability of other players to cover, I don't think winger was viewed as needing immediate attention, despite the position not being ideal. Last, but certainly not least, are the strikers. Robin van Persie was coming off a ridiculous season where he won the Premier League's Golden Boot. Let's not forget that Rooney was a top-tier player as well. Even the depth was solid. Welbeck could do a job, and Hernandez was coming off 3 straight double-digit Premier League seasons for United. There was some drama around Rooney requesting a transfer, but in the end nothing came of it. Striker was not an issue. Looking at the team at the time, I would say that United needed a left back and a midfielder. Other positions could use an upgrade, sure, but those two looked like the real needs. And they were the positions United was linked with signing. There was some speculation around Gareth Bale, but I don't think they could have beaten Madrid to the Welshman, though a left-footed winger would have been helpful. So let's look at who United wanted to sign. Moyes made it clear that he was interested in midfielder Cesc Fabregas. The former Arsenal star had been finding it difficult to break into one of the greatest teams of all time in early 2010s Barcelona. This target made perfect sense. He was an extremely talented player that was already proven in England that could reasonably want to leave his club. The next two were a duo. Moyes wanted to bring Marouane Fellaini and Leighton Baines with him from Everton. On the face of it, those moves make sense as well. Fellaini is a midfielder, a position of need, and has a different profile to Carrick and Fabregas. United's biggest problem in the 12-13 season was that their midfield was too weak defensively. Fabregas was great on the ball, but didn't offer much off of it. Plus, Carrick was 32. So bringing in the 6'4" Belgian could work. And Baines was the Premier League's top left back the previous season. What's not to like? The problem is that both players had a history with Moyes. For one, this meant that Everton knew United wanted them and could drive their fees up high. But more importantly, it points to a weakness in scouting. Did Manchester United really think that the two best possible players in the world to sign just so happened to be at Moyes' old club? Or did they not bother doing effective scouting? It's been well documented that Liverpool's scouting department overrode Jurgen Klopp when making signings, including forcing Mo Salah onto him. Good teams ask the manager what profile of player they want, then use scouting and data to find the best possible fit. United just asked Moyes who he wanted and went with it. And while this is getting ahead of ourselves, it is a problem that has continued to hound United for over a decade. But the club had a plan in place, signed 2 midfielders and a left back. Even if I had my doubts over 2 of the signings, they would fill positions of need. Adding a world-class player in Fabregas plus the Premier League's top left back in Baines wouldn't be a bad summer by any stretch of the imagination. So how did the window go? United only signed Fellaini. This feels like the right time to mention that Ferguson wasn't the only longtime staff member to leave Old Trafford in 2013. Chief executive and transfer guru David Gil also departed United. Gil was regarded as a great partner to Ferguson. He helped Sir Alex rebuild the squad that took back its place as the Premier League's top team after Roman Abramovich poured his Russian oligarch money into Chelsea. Gil was amazing at building a team, but he was no longer there. This meant that United not only had to replace a great manager in Ferguson, but also a top chief executive in Gil. And the Glazers' choice for Gil's successor was Ed Woodward. Woodward first joined United after helping the Glazers take over the club. He was a marketing and accounting professional who, it should be said, was amazing for United's brand. Because of this, he was rewarded by the owners with the power to affect the team on the pitch. He had no previous football experience. The Glazers gave him the job solely because he was a good businessman. I will give Woodward credit in that he understood that he was not a football person and let Moyes choose the signings that summer. But that's still much worse than having an actual director of football that knows how to spot talent. So all Woodward was there to do was sign the players. Surely the businessman could do that. United had several bids for Fabregas turned down as the La Masia graduate made it clear he wanted to stay in Barcelona, at least for one more year. Meanwhile, United refused to meet Everton's valuation for Baines and Fellaini. United wanted to get the two for £40 million. Reportedly, Fellaini had a release clause of £23.5 million. Considering he later signed for United, I assume Woodward was willing to pay. This meant that United valued Baines at £16.5 million. Everton wanted a combined £43.5 million for the pair, valuing Baines at £20 million. This meant that United needed to add another £3.5 million to their bid. I know, I'm a savant. Then, as their intended move for Fabregas stalled, United pivoted to another midfield target, Ander Herrera. The 6'6" box-to-box midfielder seemed like a good partner to Carrick. United made a reported £25 million bid, but it was rejected. Herrera's release clause was around £29 million, so they needed to add another $4 million to get the deal done. So things seem pretty simple. Add $3.5 million to the combined bid for Fellaini and Baines, then add $4 million to the Herrera deal. Obviously, there will be negotiations to try to get a lower price, that's standard, but it wouldn't be hard for United to land these players. Unfortunately, Woodward and United waited around too long. By the end of August, United was yet to make a signing. This posed problems. One was that since it was so late in the window, selling clubs would have little time to replace anyone that departed. This drove up the price on United's targets. Also, Fellaini's release clause expired at the end of July. This is something that Moyes and his staff should have known. Now, United had to overspend if they wanted to get anyone. So what happened? United bid separately for Fellaini and Baines. United offered £27.5 million for the big Belgian and £15 million for Baines. If you remember, Everton had already declined a deal that valued Baines at £16.5 million. This was obviously rejected, though the Fellaini bid was accepted. If you've been doing the math, you may have noticed that United added $4 million to the bid for Fellaini. If they had added the $3.5 million to the combined offer in July, it likely would have been accepted. So no Leighton Baines. Meanwhile, on the Herrera front, United balked at the £29 million that would have been required to sign him. They thought that they could get a better deal for a midfielder than having to pay Bilbao nearly £30 million, so they stopped trying to sign the Spaniard. United would go on to sign Herrera for that fee within 12 months. This meant that late in the transfer window, United needed new targets. This initiated a scramble at the end of the window that was so chaotic, it is difficult to determine what was a rumor and what was an actual bid. It appears that United made late attempts to sign Roma's Danelli De Rossi and Madrid's Sami Khedira and Fabio Coentrao, though it was a loan move for Coentrao. Again, due to it being so late in the window, clubs were reluctant to accept. De Rossi was a lifelong Roma supporter that loved the club and was loved by the club. Very loved by the club. This move was never going to happen, and Madrid weren't willing to part with Khedira this late in the window. But Coentrao was a different story. With the emergence of Marcelo, Coentrao's playing time was only decreasing at Madrid, and he was still a very talented player. This is a move that made sense, even if he would only decline after the season due to injuries. Remember, this isn't a hindsight rebuild. But before that could happen, Madrid needed to sign a backup first. And unfortunately for United, Los Blancos weren't able to. This led to Madrid pulling out of the deal at the last second. I wonder if United held a grudge. So at the end of the transfer window, the first one in the post-Ferguson era, United only signed Marouane Fellaini, the player who was the biggest risk out of their three targets. This window was a failure. I would also be remiss to not mention United's choice to not sell anyone. Out of their entire first-team squad from 2012-13, only Scholes departed the club and he retired. In fact, Fabio, who had been out on loan, returned to the first team. This resulted in a bloated squad full of players Moyes didn't use. During the season, Nani, Anderson, Fabio, and Butner barely featured and likely could have been sold for something. But for some reason, Nani was given a new contract. While I don't think it negatively affected United too much this season, onboarding, not offboarding, was their issue. It is another worrying sign of things to come. Now, onto the actual matches. I'm not going to talk about every game in detail, but I will go over several at the very start of the season to give context for what went wrong. I'm going to do United a favor and not dig into their awful preseason, which included the first team losing to a group of Thai All-Stars. It was bad, but United wasn't great in Ferguson's last preseason, so I don't think it would be productive to dig into non-competitive matches. Instead, we start with a quasi-competitive match, the Community Shield. United earned their spot in the curtain raiser by winning the Premier League. They faced now championship side Wigan Athletic, who were relegated after shocking Man City to win the 2013 FA Cup final. Just like how Crystal Palace beat City to win the 24-25 FA Cup, though my Eagles finished 12th, as we do. United won 2-0 with both goals coming from Van Persie. Wigan had some good spells throughout the match. Once United scored their second goal, the game was over. Overall, it was the bare minimum for United. They won the game, but didn't look great while doing it. But I think that's normal for a new manager's first competitive game. There's some things I'd like to note from the match. Zaha made his United debut, starting on the right wing. Also, Raphael picked up an injury that would keep him out until October. Better hope Phil Jones is ready to play a sustained run of fixtures. Then came the Premier League opener against Swansea City, the reigning League Cup champions. United cruised to a 4-1 victory with Van Persie and Welbeck each scoring twice. To make things better, Rooney came off the bench, a sign that he was staying at Old Trafford. There are some flaws to the performance, though. Giggs and Cleverley were clearly lacking in midfield, and Jones performed poorly out of position. But not bad. They followed that up with a 0-0 draw against Jose Mourinho's Chelsea. Rooney had some good moments, but the team showed nothing in attack. But again, the defense performed well, with Jones looking a bit better. Next, United lost to Liverpool in the last game before the transfer window closed. Liverpool would go on to mount a title challenge, but their star player Luis Suarez was suspended for biting Branislav Ivanovic. It was a poor game from United. The midfield was in shambles and there was nothing offered from the wide men. In addition, Phil Jones picked up an injury, shocker, which meant Valencia had to be played at right back, which we now know isn't a bad thing. Only getting 1 point from 2 matches against the top 6 isn't good, but there would be the addition of Fellaini coming, so let's wait until the end of September to really pass judgments on the squad. Next, United beat a 10-man, recently promoted Crystal Palace side 2-0. It wasn't easy until Palace got a red card that also gave away a pen. Fellaini and Januzaj both made their debuts, and Fabio started at right back. The momentum continued with a 4-2 win against Leverkusen in the Champions League. The midfield looked better with Fellaini, and the Rooney-Van Persie partnership performed well. But even in the win against Leverkusen, the defense, specifically the 34-year-old Ferdinand, struggled. Then came the game against Man City. City destroyed the Red Devils in a game that showcased the gap between the two teams. The defense was ineffective at stopping the City attack, the midfield was overrun, and Welbeck did a poor job filling in for Van Persie, who was out with a knock. It was a terrible performance. Though this was a strong City side that would go on to win the Premier League, it would always be difficult to defeat them in the Etihad. And United had a tough start to the season with Chelsea, Liverpool away, and City away in their first 5 Premier League matches. Then they lost at home to West Brom. This was the moment that the season looked really bad. United had won a home League Cup match against Liverpool midweek with a rotated squad, and several of those players retained their place. Jones returned to right back after a good performance in midfield, Evans at center back, Butner at left back, Anderson midfield, Kagawa and Nani out wide, and Hernandez up front. Butner, Anderson, Kagawa, and Nani were all ineffective. Jones did not perform at right back again. Evans wasn't bad individually, but didn't do well partnering Ferdinand, who had another poor performance. And Chicharito didn't get any service. It was a microcosm of how bad the season had started for United. Let's take a step back. I think I've made it clear how incompetently the front office prepared United for the season, but we need to talk about Moyes' role as well. Now, Moyes is clearly a good manager. He got the United job because he was great at Everton, and since leaving Old Trafford, he guided West Ham to the Conference League title. I am fully aware that David Moyes is good at his job and he wasn't walking into the best situation. But there are some very real criticism of Moyes' time at United. Starting off, there were several issues with his player selection, the biggest of which being Rio Ferdinand. Ferdinand is, in my opinion, the greatest Premier League center back of all time, and he was coming off a good season. But he's 34. During the latter stages of the 12-13 campaign, Ferguson often rotated Rio out of the team. This both gave Ferdinand a chance to recover and allowed younger center backs to gain experience. But Moyes played the 34-year-old for the full 90 in the first 7 Premier League and Champions League games of the season. This ran the center back into the ground, and Ferdinand never recovered. I've heard it said that Ferguson left Moyes with a bad team, even though United had just won a title. And while the squad definitely needed to be refreshed, maybe it would have seemed better if Moyes had managed the team correctly. Next is right back. I don't want to fault Moyes too much for the issues at right back. The starter Raphael was injured and United didn't sign a backup. But Jones wasn't working even as a stopgap. Playing Jones at center back to rotate with Ferdinand or even in midfield where he looked good would have been a better use of talent. The best performer at right back was Valencia, but Moyes refused to look at the Ecuadorian as a defender. So Valencia just kept ineffectively playing out wide. And the wingers were another issue. None of Valencia, Young, Kagwa, or Nani impressed, but they were getting all the minutes. Januzaj was beginning to break through, though he'd yet to make his first start. The elephant in the room is Wilfried Zaha. Zaha came to United as one of the most exciting players in the Championship and all of England, but despite getting nothing from his wingers, Moyes refused to select Zaha. From what I've read about Zaha's time at Old Trafford, he wasn't as professional as he should have been at a club like Manchester United. Given that Zaha also underwhelmed at Galatasaray and Lyon, one could make the argument that he was only capable of shining when he was a team's star man, like he was at Crystal Palace. I am going to give my perspective as an admittedly biased Palace fan. Moyes failed to get the best out of Zaha. He was for a time one of the best wingers in the Premier League and was certainly talented enough to compete with United's wingers. And he was at his best in South London when surrounded by great players. Olise, Eze, and Bolasie, who was awesome before he did his ACL, all shined alongside Zaha. And if he wasn't training well, that speaks to Moyes' man management ability. Motivating players is a part of being a top manager, and that was something Ferguson excelled at. I think that Moyes not getting anything out of Zaha contributed to United's struggles, though this is coming from an admittedly biased perspective. Next, we need to talk tactics. And this is a complicated conversation, as it's hard to see the difference between Moyes' and Ferguson's tactics at a glance. Obviously, Moyes' teams didn't do well, but they were lined up in the same way. I've seen Moyes criticized for using a 4-4-2, but it was more of a 4-2-3-1 with Rooney operating as a 10, and 4-2-3-1s were the Premier League's dominant tactic at the time. I believe the issue with Moyes at United was more esoteric. While I'm sure you can write a book on the different tactics Ferguson employed, tactics were always secondary to his team. Ferguson is comparable to Carlo Ancelotti in that he gave his players the freedom to express themselves. There wasn't in-depth positional play like Pep's teams or heavy metal gegenpressing like Klopp's. He just built a solid base for his squad and let his players loose. Moyes didn't understand this. His training sessions often focused on defending out of possession. This was opposed to the on-ball sessions that Ferguson ran, or at this point in his career, it's more likely that one of his assistants ran it. So while United may not have looked that different, the players lost the feeling of freedom they had under Ferguson. The training also had the effect of bringing a sort of underdog mentality to a team that had always viewed itself as the best. Moyes' problem was bringing too many of his Everton ideas to Old Trafford. This is a consequence of gutting the backroom staff that knew United's identity. And again, this is getting ahead of ourselves. This could have started the slip away from the title-winning culture at United under Ferguson to the current United. So that's where the club is at. After winning the Premier League, United had an awful summer where they failed to land any good players. In addition, David Moyes wasn't doing well in his admittedly poor conditions. This left United 12th at the end of September. The post-Ferguson era started with a disaster. At this point, we can speed things along. United saw Januzaj have his breakout performance with 2 goals and a 2-1 win against Sunderland. Following a draw to a strong Pochettino-led Southampton team, United went on a 4-match winning streak, culminating in a 1-0 victory against league leaders Arsenal, which got United within a point of the top 4. But this was followed by a 4-match winless streak, which left the club in 9th. United weren't able to get back to 5th, let alone the top 4. Touching on the cup competitions, United lost to Swansea in their first match of the FA Cup, though this was with a heavily rotated team as they had the League Cup semi-final first leg in 2 days. They lost to Sunderland 2-1 and the Black Cats advanced on penalties in the second leg. With that, the Champions League became the only way for United to salvage their season. Before that, I'd like to go over United's January transfers. United sold Fabio to former United player Ole Gunnar Solskjaer's Cardiff City and loaned them Zaha. While Fabio enjoyed his time in Wales, the player still with United, Zaha, only regressed under Ole as Cardiff were relegated. Foreshadowing. Anderson was loaned to Fiorentina, which was unsuccessful as well. But the big news was the signing of Juan Mata. Mata had been a star at Chelsea since he arrived in the fall of 2011. His creativity and skill helped Chelsea win the Champions League, with Mata providing the assist for Drogba's equalizer against Bayern. He then helped Chelsea win the Europa League the following year while leading the competition as well as the Premier League in assist. He was named Chelsea Player of the Year in both 11-12 and 12-13 over the likes of Drogba, Lampard, Terry, Cech, and Hazard. But then Jose Mourinho arrived. Jose wanted more defensively from his midfielders and dropped Mata in favor of Oscar. Mourinho also let go of Kevin De Bruyne and Mo Salah during his second stint in West London, so maybe he wasn't the best judge of players anymore. Foreshadowing. This decision meant that a star player was available for United to sign, and Woodward didn't mess around this time. Mata joined Manchester United. Normally, January transfers aren't ideal. They can work, like Van Dijk to Liverpool, but they're usually short-term issues. First, the player doesn't get to participate in preseason and just joins the team in the middle of a campaign. It can be difficult for that player to integrate into the squad and make an impact. In addition, prices are typically higher in the winter as clubs don't like to part their players mid-season. But with Mata, those issues don't apply. United needed the help and weren't disrupting a winning squad. And Mata was clearly unhappy at Chelsea, so his price tag decreased some. Everything made sense. Except for where he'd play. Mata was a 10, an attacking midfielder that operates higher up the pitch while not offering much defensively. Mata was great in this role, but there was a problem. That's where Rooney played. You could push Rooney further forward, but that means dropping Van Persie. United didn't need a 10, so Mata was often played out wide. Now, the Spaniard's left-footed, it could feasibly be transitioned to a winger, but with the emergence of Januzaj, a left-footed winger wasn't in need anymore. I mean, in hindsight it still was, but at the time the Belgian was a wonder kid. Either way, Mata never really looked comfortable out wide, and considering that United signed Angel Di Maria just a few months later, I don't think the club ever looked at him as a winger. Mata didn't fit with this team. In fact, United would never utilize him properly. This was especially egregious, as United was already struggling to fit Kago into the team for the same reasons. So why was Mata signed? Well, the club was under fire for both the terrible performances on the pitch and the horrible summer transfer window off of it. So when the opportunity came to sign a big name, Woodward took it. The signing of Juan Mata wasn't a football decision. It was a business decision made by an accountant. The only thing left to talk about is the Champions League knockout stage. After winning their group, United drew Greek side Olympiacos. This was probably the weakest team left in the competition, so the club got pretty lucky. United lost 2-0 in the first leg. I don't want to disrespect this Olympiacos team, who had some good players like Joel Campbell, who shined at that summer's 2014 World Cup, but the result was unacceptable. This wasn't even one of those games where the opposing goalkeeper saved everything, then they grabbed 2 lucky goals against the run of play. No, United were outclassed. But the sad thing about Moyes' United team is that may have been the best possible result, because now the club had no expectations heading into the return leg. United won 3-0 in Manchester, with Van Persie netting a hat-trick. I'd say the result was the bare minimum, but United got it done. And the club's reward was facing the previous year's champion, Bayern Munich. That might seem like the worst possible draw, but you have to remember the energy Moyes brought to this United team. They thrived while being the underdogs. In the first leg at Old Trafford, United drew 1-1. It wasn't an amazing performance, but they raised their level of play to match Pep's team. But in the return leg, Bayern defeated United. Even if they had the perfect mentality, the difference in squad quality due to the terrible transfer window was too much to overcome. 2 weeks later, Moyes was sacked after a loss to his old club Everton. It wasn't a difficult decision. Even if Moyes wasn't the cause of all of United's problems, he certainly wasn't blameless in the dumpster fire of a season. He was replaced by Ryan Giggs on an interim basis as a player manager before his retirement at the end of the season. This is before we knew everything about him, so it seemed sensible at the time. Giggs led the team to 7 points their last 4 matches, though it wasn't against difficult opposition. He also gave debuts to youngsters Tom Lawrence and James Wilson, with the latter netting twice in his debut. Giggs would not become United's permanent manager. But that's a story for another day. Right now, I want to look at the squad again and see what it looks like after the season. One more time from back to front. De Gea came out of the season looking the best. He won the club's Player of the Year award as his shot-stopping ability shined. He was rarely, if ever, at fault for United's failures. United had one of the best goalkeepers in the world. On the opposite end of the spectrum, center-back was a huge problem. Ferdinand and Vidic would be departing after the season. Arguably the greatest Premier League center-back pairing of all time were moving on. It was definitely time for Rio to leave, but Vidic was the best of United center-backs, so moving him on was a risk. It paid off as Vidic struggled the next season at Inter, but I wouldn't have faulted United for keeping hold of their captain. For the youngsters, Smalling and Evans didn't impress. There was some hope they could improve with consistent playing time now that Vidic and Ferdinand were gone, though. Phil Jones was a victim of his own versatility and didn't nail down a spot on the team as he was filling in everywhere. But he looked good while doing it, and there was some excitement around his future. Fullback was another issue, even worse than it was before the season started. Ever was one of United's better players, but he'd only gotten older. Remember that United tried to replace him in the summer. He signed an extension, but United were looking for his replacement. His backup Butner hadn't shown anything. On the right, things were bad too now. Rafael regressed under Moyes, and since his brother Fabio was sold, there was no true backup, though Valencia had played there a bit more often. Help was definitely needed at the back. The midfield may have been worse than it was in the summer. Carrick had a poor season with little help alongside him. Given his performances that he would be 33 at the start of the 14-15 campaign, I would say that United needed a plan for his replacement. And he was the best of the midfielders. Anderson was so bad he was loaned out, Cleverley was poor as well, and Fellaini failed to live up to his price tag and be anything other than a big body at the end of a match. Fletcher did make his return from illness and looked okay, but he wasn't in United's long-term plans. I'd argue that Phil Jones was United's best defensive midfielder, and he is a center back. Out wide, things improved a bit. Adam Januzaj emerged as a wonder kid. While the consistency wasn't there yet, he was an immensely talented youngster that United could lean on for the future. But he was the lone bright spot, as none of Nani Young nor Valencia showed any real improvement. And I've already gone over Wilfried Zaha. Januzaj's emergence was promising, but winger was another weak position. Thankfully, we had to end on a high with the next two spots. At the 10, United had an abundance of talent. Juan Mata shined for United when he played as an attacking midfielder. He may not have been superb out wide, but when he was behind the striker, he looked great. Kago was another player that looked pretty good when he played, but he struggled to get into the United's team ahead of Mata and Rooney. I'll repeat that while Mata did well, I don't see the point in signing him when Kago was already underused. But there was a lot of talent in attack midfield, even if you consider Rooney a striker. Speaking of, lastly we have striker, another strong position. First there's Rooney, who played the 10 several times, but one could make the case that Rooney should go back to being a 9. With a talented young attacking midfielder like Mata in the squad, Rooney didn't need to drop back into midfield. He only did so in the first place to help accommodate other players, so moving back up the pitch to accommodate Mata made sense. The year before Van Persie arrived, Rooney had a 27-goal season. But let's not forget about Van Persie's talent. He had a dip in production due to some injuries, but still shined for United in moments. It would be a tough task to fit Mata, Rooney, and Van Persie in the same squad, but it was a good problem to have. But with all these stars further up the pitch, playing time is limited. This was felt by Welbeck and Hernandez this season. Welbeck actually had a real purple patch, scoring 6 and 6 when both Rooney and Van Persie were injured, but that was 6 of his 9 goals in 25 Premier League matches. It was clear that in order for him to reach his full potential, he needed to leave Old Trafford. But that wasn't a huge issue. Hernandez was still there at his depth, though if he wanted to move on after not playing much, that would be understandable. Even still, United had a promising youngster in Wilson. Striker was not a concern for United, and it would be stupid to say, signed Falcao. Despite ending that squad review on a high, as you can see, things weren't great for United. There were some aging stars, Van Persie, Carrick, and Evra, unproven youngsters in Januzaj, Jones, and Rafael, and the only talented players in their prime were the goalkeeper, plus Rooney and Mata, who played the same position. It wasn't great. To be honest, at this point, I'd say they were in the same spot as their rivals, Liverpool. Liverpool mounted a great title challenge that season, but just let it slip at the end. To make things worse, that summer they lost their star player Luis Suarez. This left Liverpool with a team that had a bad defense and a midfield consisting of an aging Steven Gerrard and a good, but not great, Jordan Henderson. Further forward, they're promising youngsters in Coutinho and Sterling, but Sterling had found success at the 10, and that was Coutinho's best position. Sturridge up front looked great, though. Again, not a hindsight rebuild. I would make the case that the two teams were in a very similar spot at the end of the 13-14 season. In fact, I'd argue that United had more to work with. We will see how the two teams' paths diverge in the near future. So there you have it. Manchester United got off to a disastrous start to its post-Ferguson era. The combination of terrible transfers, a manager out of his depth, and a staff that just didn't get it caused United to have its worst season of the Premier League era. Well, its worst season of the Premier League era so far. But it wasn't anything the team couldn't rebound from. This was one of, if not the richest club in the world that still had a core of title-winning players. There's no reason why United couldn't rebuild. But that's what we'll examine next time.